Betty Alexander was born in approximately 1947 or 1948 in Glasgow, Scotland. Glasgow in those years was a city rebuilding itself after the Second World War. The great industries that had made Glasgow one of the most important cities in the world, the shipyards of the Clyde, the locomotive works, the engineering and manufacturing that had supplied the British Empire for a century, were still running, still employing hundreds of thousands of working people, still giving the city its identity and its pride. But they were running in a world that had been changed almost beyond recognition by 6 years of war. Rationing was still in force. Housing was overcrowded. Families were crammed into tenements that had been old before the war. The children of Glasgow played in the streets because there was nowhere else to go. The back courts and the lanes and the stone steps of the tenements were their world, and they knew every corner of them. Mothers watched from windows and doorways, neighbours called across closes. Glasgow in those years had a fierce community spirit. People who shared walls and staircases and courtyards looked after each other as a matter of course. Everyone on the street knew each other. Children ran in and out of each other's homes. The city was tough, and it was poor, and it was loud, and it was alive with the particular warmth of working people who had survived the worst and were getting on with things together. It was into this Glasgow, noisy, communal, tightly bound, that Betty Alexander was born. She lived with her parents, Jack and Barbara Alexander, and her grandmother Isabel Alexander, in a flat at 43 Buccleuch Street in the Garnet Hill area of the city. Garnet Hill sat on a steep hill north of Sauchiehall Street, one of Glasgow's most famous thoroughfares. It was a neighbourhood of sandstone tenements, boarding houses, theatres, and an ever-changing mix of seasonal workers, young families, actors, and long-term residents. In those years, it was known as the bed site and theatre land district of the city. The tenement at number 43 Buccleuch Street let out rooms to lodgers alongside the families who lived there permanently. People came and went through its doors with the regularity of a busy household in a busy part of a busy city. Betty was a child full of life. She was known throughout the neighbourhood, not just by her appearance, but by her personality. Even at 4.5 years old, she was known for loving nothing more than helping people. She would go to the shops for neighbours. She would run errands without being asked. She had an instinct for kindness that was noticed and remembered by the adults around her. She had curly fair hair that her mother Barbara brushed as neat as possible, though it was unruly by nature. She had brown eyes that sparkled. On the right-hand side of her forehead, there was a small scar. She was described in the words of those who knew her and wrote about her as a smiling-faced little girl, a child whose face was open and warm and easy to remember. She was 4.5 years old, and she was exactly the kind of child that a street like Buccleuch Street was built around. In October 1952, Glasgow was an ordinary autumn city. Britain was slowly climbing out of the hardship of the war and its aftermath, but the recovery was slow and the daily life of working families had not changed dramatically from the years before. The streets of Garnet Hill on a Tuesday afternoon were filled with the sounds that always filled them. Children playing outside after school, the calls of mothers from windows, the business of ordinary Glasgow life going on around every corner. On Tuesday, the 7th of October, 1952, Betty Alexander left her home at 43 Buccleuch Street to play outside with friends. She was dressed smartly, a fawn brown coat over a kilt, a grey and red jersey, fair stockings and brown shoes. Her curly fair hair had been brushed. Her brown eyes were bright. Her parents, Jack and Barbara, last saw her at around 5:30 in the afternoon, playing outside near the front of the tenement with friends. After that, Betty simply was not there. When he did not come in, her mother Barbara went out to look for her. She walked the streets and lanes around Buccleuch Street, calling her daughter's name. There was no sign of the little curly-haired girl. Neighbours joined the search. The police were alerted. At around 8 o'clock that evening, Barbara Alexander thought she heard her daughter's voice, calling to her from the lane that ran between Buccleuch Street and West Graham Street. She walked the full length of that gas-lit alleyway, peering into back courts and shadowy corners, calling Betty's name. She found nothing. A neighbour told police she had witnessed a small girl being led away by a short, stout, middle-aged man dressed in a blue suit. That tip was followed up by investigators, but was never successfully traced. The search that followed was one of the largest ever mounted in the city of Glasgow. Led by Chief Detective Inspector Neil Beaton, squads of police officers and policewomen worked through the night and the following days, combing disused air raid shelters, dark closes, little-used lanes, back courts, and every corner of the Garnet Hill area. Kelvingrove Park was searched. A stretch of the canal at Port Dundas was dragged. Photographs of Betty were placed on every police box and at every police station throughout Glasgow. Reports flooded in from people claiming to have seen the smiling-faced little girl. Every single one was followed up, and none of them led anywhere. 2,000 police officers were involved in the search at its height. A group of mothers from the Garnet Hill area, led by the Alexanders' next-door neighbour, Mrs. Rose McGinley, organised themselves into groups and set off to search the surrounding areas of Anderston and Partick. Rose McGinley told the Daily Record, "Most of these women have been neglecting their homes to help look for Betty. I have spent over 16 hours going over back courts and closes in the district and will go on looking until she is found." Buccleuch Street, usually an area filled with the voices of playing children, fell silent. Mothers met their young children from the school gates and walked them straight home. Doors were locked. The city held its breath. On the morning of Friday, the 10th of October, 1952, 3 days after Betty had last been seen, a cleaner arrived at a backyard behind the children's dispensary on West Graham Street, approximately 200 yards from the Alexanders' home at 43 Buccleuch Street. The yard was little used. The cleaner entered it and found Betty Alexander's body propped against a short run of stone steps. She had suffered a serious assault and had died from shock. She was 4.5 years old. The news reached the Alexander family, who had maintained an unbroken vigil since Betty disappeared. The city received the news in grief and outrage. Crowds gathered in the rain at the end of the lane, standing 10 deep well into the night, as police officers photographed, dusted, and finger-searched the crime scene. People stood outside the police station when rumours circulated about a possible arrest. When Betty's funeral cortege passed through the streets of Glasgow, crowds lined the route. A sea of bare heads and headscarves and the small upturned faces of curious children. The investigation that followed was unprecedented in Scottish policing. Convinced that the killer was a local man who Betty might have known, and working from a partial fingerprint found in the yard where she was discovered, police launched Scotland's largest ever fingerprinting exercise. Every adult male in the Garnet Hill area was brought in for testing. More than 1,000 sets of fingerprints were taken in total. 3,000 witness statements were gathered. Not a single fingerprint matched. Not a single witness statement led to an arrest. Glasgow's Chief Constable Malcolm McCulloch issued a public statement to all men in the area and also had it reprinted in the press. He gave the assurance that all fingerprint records would be destroyed following the inquiry, an assurance made to encourage men who might otherwise be reluctant to come forward. More than 800 sets of fingerprints had been taken by the morning after his announcement, and specially detailed officers began the painstaking work of comparing each one against the partial print found on the yard gate. No match was found. One lead took 2 senior detectives all the way to Inverness. A man had left his lodgings in Garnet Hill suddenly on the 8th of October, the day after Betty disappeared. Investigators tracked him down and interviewed him. He gave a satisfactory explanation for his departure and was cleared. The detectives returned to Glasgow with nothing new. The investigation slowly lost momentum. The team was reduced from its peak strength, first to 40 officers and then to only a handful. The press moved on to other stories. The case of Betty Alexander was set aside, though never officially closed in 1955, 3 years after the murder. Betty's parents called for the investigation to be reopened after what they described as new evidence coming to light. What that evidence was has never been publicly confirmed. The appeal did not produce a resolution. In 2012, Strathclyde Police passed the details of Betty's case to the Crown Office Specialist Cold Case Unit. The case was formally reviewed. It did not produce a breakthrough. In October 2022, 70 years after Betty's body was found, her family made what they described as what might be their final realistic appeal for information. Betty's brother, Andy Alexander, who had been born the year after his sister died and who had never known her, spoke publicly on the family's behalf. He said, "The family would wish that this crime be solved, even given how remote a possibility that is. The police cold case team have been very good with us over the years, and we are grateful for their efforts. We would love to have a sense of closure over what happened." Police Scotland stated that the officer who had led the team that finally solved the 46-year-old murders of Renee McRae and her son was now leading the investigation into Betty's case. They vowed not to give up, even though the perpetrator, if still alive, would now be at minimum in their mid-80s. It was acknowledged that the killer might long be dead. No one has ever been charged with the murder of Betty Alexander. The case remains officially open. Hello everyone, thank you for listening and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.